the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, the latest in the Witches of Carey series, an anthology of zombie fiction and a novel of hard SF. Plus, we continue our ongoing audiobook serialization of Timothy Zahn's Cobra, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. It's a pleasure to have you along. I am Baen Associate Editor and your podcast host, David Afsharirad. A New Clan is David Weber and Jane Lindskold's latest entry in the Honorverse prequel Star Kingdom series. Previous entries in the series are A Beautiful Friendship, Fire Season, and Tree Cat Wars. They all followed the adventures of Honor Harrington's several times great-grandmother, Stephanie Harrington, when she was a teenager. Stephanie's family moves to the planet Sphinx, where she meets an enigmatic tree cat named Lionheart, and the two soon find themselves caught up in all sorts of trouble. A New Clan picks up where Tree Cat Wars left off. The series is aimed at young adult readers, but it will appeal to science fiction fans and folks who love a good story of all ages. This week, DJ Butler sat down with Weber and Lindskold to discuss the series and A New Clan. But first, the news. We're winding up the merry month of May, and that means the June mass market paperbacks have hit bookstore shelves. Let's take a look. First up is The Shaman of Carey's by Eric Flint and Dave Freer. Starship Captain Possart and the Witches of Carey's must deal with a slaver culture that makes slaves feel happy to be in chains. And the youngest of the witches, the Leewit, begins to awaken to her full powers as a healer. Next up is the Black Tide Rising series anthology, We Shall Rise, edited by John Ringo and Gary Poole. Stories set in the world of New York Times bestselling author John Ringo's Black Tide Rising series. Stories by Kevin J. Anderson, Brendan Du Bois, Jody Lynn Nye, Michael Z. Williamson, Casey Azell, Mike Massa, Christopher L. Smith, Lydia Scherer, Jason Cordova, Brian Trent, Patrick Vanner, and Jamie Ibsen. And finally, we have Frontier by Patrick Childs. While on a routine search and rescue mission, Marshall Hunter and the crew of the Borman encounter deception and peril. The Borman itself becomes hopelessly disabled, while back in near-Earth orbit, cislunar space falls into chaos as critical satellites fail and valuable lunar mineral shipments disappear in transit. Facing an impossible choice between salvation and sacrifice, Marshall Hunter has to find a way to save both his crewmates and space-age civilization itself from an insidious foe. That's The Shaman of Carey's, We Shall Rise, and Frontier, all available now in mass market paperback. Can't get enough of Anne McCaffrey? To celebrate the reprinting of The City Who Fought, we're offering ebook discounts on all our McCaffrey backlist. For the month of May, get $1 off every Anne McCaffrey novel we publish. Sale ends May 31st, and this discount is good wherever Baen ebooks are sold. And that's it for the news.
Hello, this is Dave Butler. I'm here with Jane Lindskold and David Weber to talk about their new novel, The New Clan, A New Clan. It's now out in hardcover and in all your favorite ebook formats, DRM free when you buy it at Baen Books, of course. Jane Lindskold is the award-winning New York Times best-selling author of over 30 novels, including the 6-volume Firekeeper saga, the 2 Athenor novels, and the 3 volumes of the Breaking the Wall series, the Artemis Awakening series, and many more. She's also written in collaboration with David Weber, Fire Season and the Tree Cat Wars, and Roger Zelazny, Donner Jack and Lord Demon. When she's not writing or reading, she's likely being ordered around by a variety of small animals. She lives in New Mexico. David Mark Weber is an American science fiction and fantasy author. He was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1952. Weber and his wife Sharon live in Greenville, South Carolina with, I've learned today, 6 cats and a dog. With a blue-collar science fiction loving father, a college English teaching mother who also owned her own ad agency in the 70s, and a lifelong love for history, he was clearly predestined to perpetrate a whole host of military science fiction and fantasy novels and anthologies. Previously the owner of the small advertising and public relations agency he took over from his mother, he has written science fiction full-time for 30 years. He's probably best known for his Honor Harrington series from Baen Books and his Safe Hold series from Tor. Jane and David, both of you, welcome very much to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
So I enjoyed reading A New Clan quite a bit. I think there's a lot of, I want to ask some sort of setup questions. One of which may not be about the stories at all. I noticed, so this is book 4 in a series, right? Am I reading that right?
Yes.
And the first 3 came out fairly close to each other, back to back, 2011 through 2013. And then we've had a gap of about 9 years. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why there could be a gap. I guess my question is there a reason that's interesting to discuss?
Well, there are no reasons related to the storyline for the gap. There were a couple of things going on, and one was that we originally had a contract for 3, which we filled, and Jane and I both wanted to come back and do more stories, but there was an awful lot on my plate. We're getting into the period when I face planted into the floor in Atlanta and gave myself a concussion, which kind of knocked me off writing it all for like the better part of 2 years. And then, of course, I was just getting over that when COVID came along, which didn't help anything health-wise. I dodged that bullet for about a year. Then I got COVID. And I had a whole bunch of other projects that had harder deadlines than a contract that hadn't been written yet for additional books in the Star Kingdom series. But we always wanted to come back to them. We always intended to. And we did, Jane did some short fiction for the next Honorverse anthology. Which is our heroes from this book. Well, okay, our heroes from A Beautiful Friendship, really more than from this book, since we have a lot more people in this one running around on Griffin, doing geology stuff. I was like totally happy to leave that to Jane. You know, hi Jane, go do geology. Well, what can I say? You know, yeah, it's been. I think it's been harder for Jane than it has for me to actually work on these books because I am so intimately familiar with the Honorverse and how it's all wired and where what we're doing in the Star Kingdom books is going to plug into what's already canon in the Honor Harrington novels. And I'm also having to balance this against what's going on in the Manticore Ascendant novels, which are happening within 40 or 50 years of these books. So I'm juggling balls, and it's hard on her sometimes for us to be on the same page to a degree that gives her the comfort that she needs to work smoothly on the books, and we're trying to I'm hoping, honest Jane, I'm really hoping to give you a a much tighter for us to work out a much tighter outline for the next book. Yes.
Let me say, in all fairness, Weber and I are very different writers. We're really good friends, but we're very different in how we write. And I'm sort of, you know, the number line of intuitive plotter and outliner. I'm kind of so far out on the intuitive plotter line that for me, being handed a please fill in the blanks, I get bored. And Weber is really terrific about trying to leave me some room in the middle so that my spark is lit and my enthusiasm for the story comes across. So he does meet, we're very different types of writer, and he really does, not try and bully me into being something I'm not. But that and the fact that these are prequels can cause us some difficulties, because sometimes we have to invent. I'll come up with a technological thing I want to do that I think is perfectly reasonable, and he'll be like, we can't do that because there's no precedent for it in the later books.
They're not doing it 300 years from now.
So, yeah, and I'm like, but to me, if you take, so we've got a lot of challenges here that a lot of Weber's other collaborators don't face, and one of them is that these are prequels and they're not military prequels. We're dealing with the people on the ground, we're dealing with the settlers, we're dealing with their things, and I think these are the only ones of his books that deal with the backstage of tree cats living with each other in their culture to this extent.
Oh, certainly to this extent, yeah.
Yeah, and so we have to invent the wheel sometimes with things like that as well. So they're very challenging books on a lot of levels.
Well, there are also instances in which I've invented the wheel, but failed to share that with Jane because it is so firmly in my visualization of the cosmic all for the Honorverse that I don't realize that it hasn't been given in canon anywhere, or that I didn't, that I haven't specifically written it down in the tech Bible.
Yeah, and there isn't a Bible for a lot of the stuff we're doing.
For what we're doing now, there isn't. I've been putting some together. For example, I had to go back and I did a chart of when the seasons break on Sphinx because we had a problem there. So I had to go back. I found this wonderful piece of software that will let you determine what any date is by the number of days between it. And I know how long each season is in Sphinxian days, which means I can calculate how long it is in Earth days, which means I can calculate. So I have this, it's just, I think I got like a 25, 30-year span of the seasons plotted out. Right. When they shift, when they change. And that's,
yeah.
I was going to say
really
that.
Important.
Yeah, it is. It is. As well as just, yeah, go Jane.
Yeah, we're on the ground. And Stephanie is a ranger. We can't do books that are written from the point of view of Stephanie and her people and just sort of gloss over what time of year it is, because these are people who, it's not just a question of, is it a story set when it's forest fire season? Oh, it's the after ramifications of having major forest fires and drought.
Yeah.
And by ranger, you mean park ranger. She's not a commander.
Forest ranger, not park ranger.
Forest ranger with a gun.
Yeah, with a really big gun.
A little person with a big gun. I really think Weber subconsciously was putting Sharon in when he invented Stephanie.
To some extent.
Little person, big gun.
Well, really the other side of it was that Honor is 6 feet 2 inches tall. Okay, and her mom is little bitty, like 5'1" or something. I didn't want Stephanie, the very first person to adopt a tree cat, to be a physical pre-clone of Honor. Although she does have the same hair, basically, if you take a look at it. They both have that curly mop when it's, not tamed. But yeah, it's the one real thing that I regret about the Honor Harrington novels is that so many of them take place either fully in space or in an artificial habitat or whatever. Honor loves her homeworld. Okay, she loves getting out in the woods and all the rest of it, but I have very limited opportunity in the novels about the war against Haven and whatnot to do scenes set there. So what this allows is for us to share with the reader more of the flavor of Sphinx. I've done this in short fiction too, when I've been able to put them out, you know, into the forests and whatnot of Sphinx. But the other thing is that what Stephanie and Honor both share in common, besides tree cats, is that they both have a very intense sense of responsibility, and they are both incredibly protective of the things that they care about, that are important to them, the people. In Stephanie's case, her environment, what she's coming to realize are the native sentience of Sphinx. And I don't know how many people who are going to be watching this know that eventually Dame Stephanie Harrington, the commander of the Sphinx Forestry Service, will be instrumental in drafting the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution of the Star Kingdom, which specifically recognizes the tree cats as the native sentient species of Sphinx and guarantees them 1/3 of the planetary surface to be maintained in unimproved virgin forest condition for them. That's who she is. And that's who Jane and I have been writing about now for 4 books, her and some pretty extraordinary other young folks who are not as young as they were when we first met them. Stephanie was 11 at the beginning of A Beautiful Friendship. I think she was either 12 or 13, I think, at the end of it. And the other thing is that I know where Stephanie and her parents fit into the history of the Harrington clan. Okay, and so one of the things that we have to be constantly aware of is how we're going to adjust to make sure that we hit those mileposts along the way. I think in some respects that's harder on Jane too, because I've got those mileposts so firmly in mind. They were part of when I created the Honorverse in the first place. This was part of Honor's sort of genealogical backstory that was implicit in what I was going to be doing with her and the Mason alignment and everything else. And it's not something that is, it's not, a lot of it are not the things that you expect to spring to mind in books which are written as YAs, but also for an adult market, if you didn't already know that they had to be there. Does that make sense?
So what's
okay? Yeah, it's
complicated.
Yeah, that's the way to put it.
I mean, that's the thing. We have 2 stories going on here. We have whatever is the inherent story that is that novel, and we've got the other story, which is the larger epic of the Honorverse.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be faithful to both of those. And although I've known Weber long enough, we met when he had 1.5 published novels and I had 1 published short story. So you can use that to try and figure out how long without either of us admitting it. But I've known him long enough to absolutely know that he's had a lot of this stuff in between his ears. But the problem is he hasn't necessarily put it down on paper in a consistent fashion, and it has evolved. Yeah. When we were starting with the tree cats, he sent me a document he had written about tree cats, but it had never really been updated. And so there were various points that I had to stop and say, okay, bud, we've got this here and we've got this here. Which one is it? And then we would come up with canon. But again, These are small points. These aren't the mega points, but when you're writing a novel, those small points come up.
Well, and to the point that Jane was making about where they fit into the greater, if you will, story arc of the Honorverse, the stories that we're writing now are the ones that establish the relationship between humans and tree cats going forward. It's also the point at which those who are fighting for the tree cat's recognition as the fully sentient beings that they are facing the greatest single threat to the tree cat's future. And that has to be worked in the background, but at the same time, each book needs to have its own conflict in terms of problem solution, if nothing else, that isn't just lost in the underbrush of, well, we are establishing that there's a problem here where the tree cats are threatened. So yeah, it is. And I have to say that Eric Flint and I just finished doing To End in Fire. And we ran into problems that in some respect are similar to what Jane and I are talking about here, but in our case, in that case of that book, it was kind of on steroids, because Jane and I by now have established where the books fall and how we need to approach them. Okay. We're still working on getting everything tweaked to where we want it. But Eric and I had a smoothly established procedure for the collaborations that he and I had done in the Honorverse, because he would write his portion of the book first, and then I would write my portion of it, and all of them followed along behind what you might call the wave front of the greater storyline. They were filling in detailed backstory about behind where the timeline had advanced to in the solo books. Well, in this instance, we were advancing beyond where the solo books ended. And so the way that we had done it in the past, with Eric writing his part first, just didn't really work. And part of it too was that he had to use a lot of my solo characters as viewpoint characters, and they weren't his characters. And so they were, as the person who built them, they were reacting in ways that I knew they wouldn't have reacted, and they were plot points. Totally, understandable. Okay, but it was one more thing that had to be adjusted. And then he got sick and I had COVID, and we literally finished that book up, sending in pages in tranches while they were being copy edited at the other end. And Jane and I have not had that problem yet. So I'm going to do my best to ensure that you don't have that problem, Jane.
That's good. Yeah, one of the things, to leave the Honorverse aside and talk a little bit about the collaboration. Mm-hmm. One thing that I think Weber and I have going for us, for one thing, I call him Weber because when I met him, there were way too many Davids in my life. And he was Weber and he stayed Weber. So we're old buddies. And this means, I think there's a degree of belief that neither of us want to drive the other two up the wall. One of my favorite anecdotes, and this is tales out of school, but it won't embarrass anybody, is we were having an email correspondence about how to work out a plot point that wasn't working. And I have an email coming from him, and he's like, the email says, basically, I could still find the text somewhere probably. It says, yeah, I think we can work this out. And then all of a sudden it changes. It goes, no, you absolutely can't do that. This is absolutely not. And I'm looking at it, and my husband was working at home, and I said to Jim, I said, I think Weber's lost his mind. I'm going to pick up the phone and find out what's going on here. And what happened is he uses voice activated software. He had turned it off. When the kids came in to ask him a question, it was obviously a question where daddy parental authority had to come on. And he had said something that had reactivated his voice activated software. He then looked at the screen, said, oh, this email looks like it's done, sent it. But if we hadn't had that level of trust, can you imagine how I would have felt to be told, no, absolutely not, you can't do that?
Okay, but I gotta tell you another story. This has nothing to do with Jane, but it's okay. Sharon is a huge Supernatural fan. Okay, so she wanted me to watch Supernatural. Now I don't watch TV on a regular basis. I tend to binge watch, after the fact. But I had really liked the series Person of Interest. So I told her, all right, I'll watch Supernatural if you watch Person of Interest. Well, I didn't realize that there were already like 12 seasons of Supernatural versus a total of 5 of Person of Interest. But she was like, okay, we can do that, But anyway, so I'm sitting out here, I'm working in the office, and my phone buzzes, and I look down, and Sharon, as she's watching an episode of Person of Interest, she says, they shot Elias. And I said, yep. And she said, is he dead? I said, I don't know, is he? She said, you're not going to tell me. I said, no, I'm not. She said, I hate you. I said, I know, So, she's going on in the episode, and she says, they really killed him, didn't they? I said, I don't know, do they? She said, I hate you even more, kind of thing. So, there's like 3 or 4 more of those exchanges. Well, what we didn't realize was that she had texted me on a thread that the kids were on.
Oh, no.
So the girls come home from school, and they go upstairs. They says, Mom? And she says, yes. Are you and Dad getting a divorce? And she's like, what are you talking about? She said, well, you said you hate him. You hate him so much. And she's like, no. Yes. So, the the perils of electronic correspondence, it's just,
That's great.
yeah. And I do have to be careful when I'm using Dragon, because if I tell it, listen to me, it switches back on. Okay. Unless I've just completely killed the mic. And so sometimes it will think I said, listen to me, or something like that, when I didn't think I said that. And I'll look down and realize that I have like 250, 300 words of a phone conversation transcribed into the middle of the chapter I was working on.
Well, there's a solution to that.
Yes.
Don't talk so much.
No, I'm sorry. That's not a solution. Okay, that is more of a hypothetical, wishful kind of solution. Okay,
So
Anyway,
So this is interesting. So when you started working on this, so back in 2010 or something, you saw this as this. So let's in case anyone is new to the Honorverse, let's just be explicit here. This is some 300 years before the Honorverse. Mm-hmm. We're in the Manticore home system, right? Sphinx is a planet that orbits the Manticore binary stars.
It's one of 3, yes.
Okay. And but it's 300 years before.
Well, that's why it's one of 3 habitable planets. I think there's 30 or something total, but okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. And so Stephanie is Honor's ancestor a number of generations in the future.
Yeah.
Now, so did you plan that? Was the series from the beginning, hey, listen, we got a 3-book deal, but we're going to do some number of books up to the point where Dame Stephanie amends the Constitution?
Well, the first novel is actually a solo novel.
Okay.
I had done a short story, A Beautiful Friendship, which was Stephanie meeting Climbs Quickly, Lionheart, who and how the tree cats are discovered. I did it for one of the anthologies because it's a pretty essential building block for how that whole relationship starts.
it's one of my favorites. I really like it.
Yeah. And then I expanded it into a novel. And it's really the first book that I ever wrote specifically thinking of it in YA terms. And I am of the Heinlein school of how you write young adult novels. You know, I don't know if you know what his response to the question was, bearing in mind that this was, I think, in the 60s or some point. They asked him, how do you write a book for younger readers? And he said, exactly the way you do for adult readers, and then you leave out the cussing and the sex. Okay. And Jane and I both, one of the things that always bugged me about the Harry Potter books is that for the first 3 or 4 books, every single adult is either malevolent or an idiot so that they can be saved by the 9-year-olds. Okay. And I have very, very, very strong feelings about like dystopian YA and that kind of thing. And so in A Beautiful Friendship, I wanted to write a book in which youthful protagonists have plenty of agency. They can accomplish a whole bunch of things. They can make a whole bunch of mistakes. Stephanie almost gets herself killed, basically because she knows best. Okay. But at the same time, the adults involved in her life are competent adults, and they understand the space that they have to give to a kid who has the level of intelligence and the level of independence and the sense of responsibility that they've built into her to this point. And that's important to me. Okay. Now, most of the villains have been malevolent-ish adults, I suppose. Although Jane, I'm thinking about rehabilitating Dr. Bolgio. I've got a novel that I'm looking at here, and I'm thinking about rehabilitating him when he gets out of jail. He stays in the Star Kingdom, and his family becomes a pillar of the Navy, you know, kind of thing. But so that was,
it's your character.
But that's how A Beautiful Friendship was conceived of and written. Okay, then we got into the next 2, which are the collaborations with Jane. And there's a lot more Jane in their DNA than there was in the solo novel that I wrote without her.
Yeah, I was backstage on the solo novel. He sent me the manuscript and I gave him feedback because he said, if you're going to have to build from here, I don't want to put anything in here that you absolutely hate and can't live with.
Yeah.
So I was backstage on A Beautiful Friendship. It's definitely his book, but he gave me the opportunity to give feedback at an earlier stage.
Yeah.
And I think some of the younger characters were introduced sooner by my prompting at that point.
That certainly sounds like what probably happened. Yeah. Now in A New Clan, I did a novella, a short story novella for the Give Me LibertyCon anthology that LibertyCon basically publishes as a memorial to Tim Bolgio. And that was the starting point for a slew of new characters who were introduced into this book. Jane is the one who came up with the mushrooms. Okay, she's been pushing me to expand the texture, I guess, of the ecology, if you will, of the books. You know, I've crown oaks and picket, you know, all that kind of stuff I had in there, but I hadn't really thought about fungi. And she's like, fungi. I know you do. And they were really, really cool. They're a really good addition. I just hadn't, if you'll pardon the expression, gotten down into the mushrooms when I was designing the ecology. And some of the same thing happened in your Griffin short story, we had to kind of work out what the unobtainium that they were finding in that book was, because it needed to be something that would be like important kind of thing. But that's what happens in collaborations, is the input of the two authors working together produces something that neither of them would have thought about solely on his or her own. And like I say, I think it's harder for Jane because the Honorverse is really my sandbox. And so many of its pillars are firmly established, that we have to look at which game rooms we can build onto the existing house in some cases to make it work. One of the things that we're able to look at in these books is, and I've been able to do that in some of the honor novels as well. And in some of the later honor novels, to be honest, it's been texturized by what we've done in the Star Kingdom books, Jane, is the fact that tree cats literally have no concept of a spoken or a written language, or even of words, when they first meet humans. That they exchange actual information packets without the need to differentiate. So they have all these, they keep saying flying things, this and that and the other. It's because they have a complete gestalt of the concept that they're exchanging with one another, but they don't have a name for it, if you see what I'm saying. And so
actually make very interesting graphic novels, because then you could do tree cat speech with like image bubbles, rather than being limited by words.
Yeah, you'd have to be really careful about how you did that, though, because you'd lose so much syntax. But see, that's part of the problem, okay, is that for the tree cats, all of the syntax is subsumed into the packet that they're exchanging. And then you add to that the fact that they're empaths, that they literally can feel one another's emotions, which makes it impossible for someone to consciously lie undetected to them. Okay. And so when they're talking about the mouth noises that Stephanie and her friends are making, just making the leap to the fact that Lionheart is her designation for Climbs Quickly. It's an enormous intellectual jump for them to make, but much greater, I think, than a lot of readers realize. Jane and I have tried to make this evident as we go along, but it is a huge conceptual leap for somebody who never even thought in differentiated words of language at all to grasp the concept of language. And that's why it takes another 300 years before they make the breakthrough into using ASL to actually communicate with the humans around them, two-way. And one thing that the tree cats haven't discovered yet, in where Jane and I are in the books, is how much longer lived tree cats are than humans. Tree cats will live 200, 250 years. Humans obviously won't. And when Climbs Quickly and Stephanie bonded, neither Climbs Quickly nor his memory singer sister understood that even though Stephanie was only like 12, that they'd have maybe 80 years, 90 years together outside. And that, like a great many mated pairs of tree cats, when the human half of the partnership dies, the tree cat half follows. Okay. And so by honors time, the tree cats understand that entirely, and they still continue to make the bonds because of what it offers to the two species. And that too is something that is a vital part of the subtext, as far as I'm concerned, that I'm not sure all readers pick up on. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
But and unfortunately, where the story arc that Jane and I have planned here for these books is going to terminate well before Stephanie's age would become an issue. So we won't be able to deal with it there. But Jane, I'm thinking of an absolute, won't be a dry eye in the house story for Dame Stephanie saying goodbye to Climbs Quickly. Okay.
You get to write that one. I've had too many people die on me this last year. I don't
Oh
think
yeah.
I can do that one.
Oh yeah, yeah. But you know, it's
So that's interesting. So the moment, like on that path of the developing relationship between the species, right? The moment where we're at in a new clan, there's a group of youth. And now Stephanie must be, I'm not sure we say her age, but she must be within spitting distance of 18, right? She's
No, she turns 16 at the end of the book.
Okay.
The book
Yeah.
ends with her 16th birthday
yeah,
party.
sorry, yeah.
yeah. We need to get to about age 19 by
Okay.
the end of the story arc we're working on, because there's a rather dramatic shift in Stephanie's life at that point that I think is the logical bookend for the stories we're telling. That doesn't mean there won't be more Stephanie and Climbs Quickly stories. What I'm saying is that's the projected endpoint for this particular story arc.
Yeah.
But in any case, you were saying.
So the moment we're at now is there's a group of young people that have each bonded to a tree cat, right?
Mhm.
But it's a pretty small group, and they have an awareness that the tree cats are sentient, but by and large, that's not a public understanding or not a public view, right?
Well,
Yeah. And that's where why we kind of coined the term the Great Tree Cat Conspiracy, because there are reasons in this time period 300 years earlier where it would actually be dangerous for the tree cats for it to be revealed. It's a really delicate juggling act, because on the one hand, we're not doing, Weber wants to avoid the whole let's put them on a reservation thing.
mm-hmm.
And yet on the flip side, it's complex.
It is, and it's made worse by the fact that the tree cats have no written or spoken language. They're the first species of actual telepaths, functional telepaths that humanity has encountered. And so they have no written records. They do have Neolithic tools that they make, flint knives. That's one of the characters in A New Clan, is was the master flint knapper for his clan before he had to leave it. And they weave baskets and so forth. So on the one hand, you can say, yes, they're tool users, but on the other hand, you have people saying, yes, but how can you can't communicate with them, you can, and the people who have been adopted, who have bonded to tree cats, realize by this point very clearly that at the very least they are telepathic. Okay, because they obviously can sense the emotions of their human partners. They can tell when they're in distress. They can come to their aid. They can try to get help for them, etc. But they still can't demonstrate their actual intelligence. And they are thinking specifically of a particular planet in which humans arrived on the planet and missed the fact that there was a sentient race, an amphibious race that built its homes underwater for security. And when the people who had settled the planet and who had financial interests and et cetera were found out about it, because this hadn't been ruled a sentient species yet, they declared they weren't, and the local and the local sentients were basically hunted into extinction before
And,
anybody could intervene.
you know, I don't, I'm married to an anthropologist. And so, you know, the whole fact that humans are in the honorverse, even in Stephanie's day, still defining sentience by human terms is a point my back fur goes up on, because being married to an anthropologist, you know, tool use, you've defined that they have pottery, and even pottery wheels in one of the notes you gave me. That's actually fairly high tech.
Yeah.
So the fact that the humans are stubbornly insisting on, you know, no, to be acknowledged as human, you've got to talk our talk, is a challenge.
Yeah, well, and part of the problem too is that what we're talking about here in a lot of ways isn't what a fair-minded person would conclude looking at the technology. What we're looking at here is what would someone with an ulterior motive use as their arguing points to say, no, these are just very clever animals. Chimpanzees use sticks back on Earth. Those are tools, you know, etc. So one of the central aspects of these books is the morality of human tree cat interaction. You know, I never set out to write a tree hugger series. Okay, I grew up on 80 acres of woodlot. Okay, I loved the woods. I have a deep respect for the natural environment. But what I was dealing with here was not, well, we must preclude any exploitation of the virgin wilderness. It was, we must protect and respect the virgin wilderness. We must preserve virgin wilderness. We must use our habitat wisely, is one of the core aspects of it. And part of using it wisely and respecting it is respecting what lives in it. Okay, whether it's sentient or not. I mean, there's when Honor meets Nimitz many years later, she's a couple of years older than Stephanie was, and she winds up rescuing Nimitz and his littermate from a pair of peak bears, who are huge, like Kodiak sized kind of thing. She deeply regrets killing these two parent peak bears, but she had to if she was going to save Nimitz and his brother, who she had not bonded with yet. This is where she meets him and how they bond. To me, that sort of sums up a lot of the conundrum of living in and respecting your natural environment. Okay, it's one of the reasons that I was a deer hunter in my youth, is because I've seen the damage that deer herds overgrazing can inflict on their habitat, and what that means for the members of the herd as they move. I also did it because I like the taste of venison, but I mean, you know, it's but what I hope is coming across in these books is a realistic, bearing in mind that it's fiction, but a realistic understanding of the interaction between responsible humans and their natural environment in a way that will resonate with people who have been there and done that, and that maybe might open some eyes for people who live in urban environments and really have no direct personal firsthand experience with nature, red in tooth and claw, kind of thing. It's the purpose of the books, from my perspective, is not to preach a message. It's not any kind of social awareness or anything like that. It's to tell a good story. But to me, telling a good story involves telling a story about people who have to make moral decisions. And that's what Stephanie and her friends are confronted with in each book. Plus, we get to see the maturation of the characters, their growth, and the degree to which they come to understand not just what they're up against in the Great Tree Cat conspiracy, but gradually even Stephanie is going to figure out, what's going on with Carl. She's just a little,
Well, what can I say? I'll not.
No, okay, look. Okay, given how long it took me to propose to Sharon, I'm fine with this. I understand how it works,
Well, and there is that, I have to admit. At one point, Weber came to visit me and he kept buying this woman back home, Sharon, all these presents, including some pretty elaborate ones and expensive ones. And I finally said, I thought you and Sharon weren't dating. Oh, no, we're not. And I said, boy, if somebody came home with this many presents for me, I'd kind of figure maybe there was something going, oh, no.
Her exact words to me were, I wish I were one of your women, Weber.
Well, you've always, but actually on a more serious point, turning YA and everything else, one of the things I said to Weber is, I realize you've already written into Stephanie's back history who she marries. That's okay with me. I can work with that. But on the other hand, neither you or I had our first marriages, both of which were pretty young, work out. And to me, there's a really dangerous aspect in a lot of middle grade and YA fiction that you meet your first true love at 11 or 12, and that's it. Everything's perfect. And I think it's a message I didn't really want to continue to promulgate. It worries me.
When Jane wrote in Stephanie's first real romantic involvement, which wasn't with Carl, okay, I was like, okay, this works, okay, because I had never envisioned her saying, okay, it's kind of like when Honor meets Paul Tankersley, who is going to become her first deep, intense love. She's kind of like, you know what, you work for that asshole Pavel Young, I'll be polite to you, kind of thing. She meets Hamish Alexander in the second book in the series, and it's not until like book 11 or 12 that she realizes, how she actually has come to feel about him. So I didn't have any problem with how long this took, but I needed to get Carl into the picture early, so that he'd be there for it to happen, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I really, Weber talked about not liking young adult and middle grade books where all the adults are either evil or stupid. And I don't like the constant emphasis that you're going to find, you can never fall in love except once. And
you're young and you'll know it when it happens. And
you're young, you'll know what happens. Lightning strikes. It sure does sometimes. My Aunt Connie met her sweetie in high school, and they were married until he died. But on the other hand, a lot more times it doesn't happen. And yet I think it puts a pressure, especially, and this is me speaking as a woman, it puts more pressure on women to feel they're a failure if they can't make that first relationship work, because so much romance is, the guy has had somebody else he was in love with. He might have even been married before, etc. But for the girl, it's one guy, one time. So if you don't, you're a failure.
Yeah.
But the challenge, I'm going to interrupt you, babes.
No, go.
The challenge for Stephanie that Weber gave us is because she has Lionheart and that telepathy, if Stephanie was going to fall for a guy, he had to be basically a good person, because Lionheart would never let her get close to somebody who was a bad person. So Stephanie's first sweetie, who is introduced in Fire Season and who becomes a recurring character, is really a good guy. And I think that's also another good message. You know, again, I don't want it to be a message, but it's a good example to be out there. Neither you nor your first sweetie need to be bad people for it not to work out.
And something that works out, is starting to work out in a new clan, is that just because you're an idiot at 15 doesn't mean that you have to stay that way. I'm thinking about Trudy here.
Oh, yes.
And the growth that she has versus the growth that Stan doesn't have along the way. One of the themes that has always been important to me in my writing is what I think of as the redemptive arc, in which, for example, in Insurrection, Steve Whitenmey's very first novel, Oscar Dieter, is really, he's responsible for the murder of a politician that he respects deeply. He doesn't have anything to do with it. He tries to stop it, but his actions are what set it in motion. And he'd always been sort of a go along to get along kind of guy. And by the end of the book, he is the effectively the prime minister of the Terran Federation, and he is actively working to make the split between the Terran Federation and the Terran Republic final and permanent, because he owes it to the people involved, and he sees how ugly it's going to be if it ends any other way. Now, Trudy is not that dramatic a case of character growth yet, but also Stephanie's character growth in being able to look at Trudy and say, you know, this is the one that I really wanted to bust in the nose repeatedly when we were younger, that she's actually a decent human being. One of the problems that Stephanie has is that she's at least 4 or 5 years older than her age, I think. Well, yes and no. I'm not talking about emotionally. Okay, I'm talking about intellectually in terms of her world horizon. Okay, now there's another factor which is going on in the backs of Jane and mine's mind. I think maybe more in the back of my mind than the back of Jane's mind, because it's integral to what's going on here. Stephanie is a genie. She's genetically modified to live in a heavy gravity environment. And unbeknownst to her, there are some additional modifications that have been incorporated into her genealogical line. And one of them is what helps to account for Honor Harrington's temper in the later books. Okay, the propensity to, as Hamish Alexander tells her on the first occasion, settle problems with direct action. You know, it's just like, well, if I just hit this guy in the head, knock him unconscious, then the problem will be solved by the time he wakes up. Go for it. You know, this doesn't work when the person you're hitting in the head is the envoy the crown has sent to negotiate the alliance. Okay. It did work out actually in Honor's case, but that's because God in the form of the author was on her side. But that's another factor that's going on in the back of my brain when I look at what Stephanie is doing in the books that we're writing now, because it has to key into that. It's not a controlling element of her character by any means, okay, but it is definitely a factor in her makeup. And yes.
I was just going to say, I completely understand this because I have a temper. You probably, we'll leave the context out, but I don't know if you remember a phone call where I said to you, would you please remind me why we don't kill our enemies?
And I said, because disposing of the bodies is a problem. I do remember that conversation.
And you also followed up by saying, and besides, I really wouldn't want to come and visit you in prison.
That's right. Orange is not your color.
So,
yeah.
so I actually have no problem with Stephanie having a temper and having to deal with it. I'm happier with that than if she was, unicorns and hearts and flowers.
Well, there's another reason why the Harrington clan in general gets along so well with the tree cats. And part of it actually does have to do with the genetic manipulation, whether I ever get around to making that explicit in the books or not. That's one of those parts of the backstage that I have to have in my head, even if I don't get around to sharing it with the readers. But one aspect of it is that almost all Harringtons believe in direct action. Okay, I mean, tree cat's view is that enemies come in two categories.
Edible and non-edible.
Well, no, ones that have been dealt with and ones that are still alive. That's pretty much how they see it. And thanks to their telepathic sense, they very seldom make a mistake in identifying who an enemy is. But they don't really understand this human, what, I can't kill him? No, you can't kill him. Well, why not? He's a bad person. But just take it from me, you can't. Okay, so it's kind of like understanding that no, you can't open the airlock on your own. It's just one of those two-leg things you gotta learn to deal with. Now, there is one other aspect of tree cats that hasn't really had to come front and center in what we've been doing here, but tree cats cannot handle advanced math. They just can't. Their brains don't work that way. Yeah, 2 + 2 is 5. Well, that's why they keep talking about hands of hands of hands when they're calculating things. Tree cats will never understand algebra. All right, I'm sorry. They're just gonna go like, huh? It's like, okay, I got written language, but why does this letter, and so one of the things that I wanted the tree cats to be from the beginning is fully the intellectual equal of the humans with whom they share their planet, but different in a way that human readers could understand and relate to, but which made them definitely not just humans in six-legged fursuits. It's been sometimes a little bit of a delicate balancing act, because even if tree cats don't have a spoken language, the only way that Jane and I can communicate what they're thinking to the reader is to use written language. But that's one reason tree cats never use contractions. Okay. Which can be a pain, but it's just part of how the language differentiations, one of the differentiations we're trying to make, and it's hard. I've written a lot of books that have aliens in them, and I've tried to have the aliens in question be aliens. But there have to be those points of contiguity with the human readers, or else the humans can't enter into and understand what the aliens are doing and why they're doing it. Okay, you're just saying because they're aliens. I'm sorry, for me as a storyteller, that doesn't work. It never worked for me as a reader either. Which doesn't mean that people can't have fully realized human characters who they suddenly have do something totally out of character that leaves me just as confused as to what's going on here. The level.
And now we bring you Timothy Zahn's Cobra. Earth's only hope was the Cobras. The colony worlds Adirondack and Silvern fell to the Troft forces almost without a struggle. Outnumbered and on the defensive, Earth made a desperate decision. It would attack the aliens not from space, but on the ground, with forces the troughs did not even suspect. Thus were created the Cobras, a guerrilla force whose weapons were surgically implanted, invisible to the unsuspecting eye, yet undeniably deadly. But power brings temptation, and not all the Cobras could be trusted to fight for Earth alone. Johnny Moreau would learn the uses and abuses of his special abilities and what it truly meant to be a Cobra.
So, the great horizon hope finally crushed one, Viljo said, setting his tray down at the far end of the table and favoring Johnny with an off-cordial smile. Johnny dropped his eyes to his own lunch and said nothing, concentrating instead on the last few bites of his meal as the blood rushed to his face. Viljo's snide comments had become more and more frequent the past couple of days, and though Johnny was trying hard not to let the other get to him, the tension of the whole thing was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Afraid of doing anything that would brand him as overly sensitive, or worse, that would emphasize his frontier origins, he could only sit on his anger and hope Viljo would get tired of his verbal target practice. Though if he wasn't, perhaps others were. Across from Johnny, Halloran hunched over the table to eye Viljo. "I didn't notice you walking away with high honors either," he said. "Matter of fact, except for Immel, I think we all got our egos nicely trimmed for show out there." "Sure, but Johnny's the one Bai always holds up like he was the ideal trainee. Haven't you noticed? I just wondered if he liked being demoted to mortal." Beside Viljo, Singh stirred in his seat. "You're exaggerating rather badly, Roland. And even if you weren't, it would hardly be Johnny's fault." "Oh, wouldn't it?" Viljo snorted. "Come on, you know as well as I do how this sort of favoritism works. Johnny's family's probably got some fix-in with Bai or even Mendro, and Bai's making sure they're getting their money's worth." And with that, the insults crossed a fine line, and Johnny abruptly had had enough. In a single smooth motion, he stood up and leaped over the table, dimly aware of his chair slamming backwards into the next table as he did so. He landed directly behind Viljo, who, apparently caught by surprise, was still seated. Johnny didn't wait for the other to respond. Grabbing a fistful of shirt, he hauled Viljo upright and spun him around. "That's it, Viljo. That's the last brief dropping I'm going to take from you. Now back off, understand?" Viljo eyed him calmly. My. So you have a temper after all. I suppose brief dropping is just one of those colorful expressions you use out there in the backwaters?" That final smirk was too much. Letting go of Viljo's shirt, Johnny threw a punch at the other's face. It was a disaster. Not only did Viljo duck successfully out of the way, but with his servos providing unaccustomed speed to his swing, Johnny was thrown completely off balance and rammed his thigh hard into the table before he could recover. The pain fanned his anger into something white-hot, and with a snarl he twisted around and hurled another blow at Viljo. Again he missed, but even as his arm cocked for a third try, something pinioned it in midair. He shoved against the grip, succeeded only in losing his balance again. "Easy, Johnny, easy," a voice murmured in his ear. And with that, the red haze abruptly vanished from his brain, and he found himself standing in a room full of silent Cobra trainees, his arms gripped solidly by Deutsch and Nafki, facing Viljo, who, completely unmarked, looked altogether too self-satisfied. He was still trying to sort it all out when the room's intercom monitor ordered him to report to Mendro's office.
That was another installment in Timothy Zahn's Cobra. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks as always to Audible.com and podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Thanks to DJ Butler, and praise, thanks, and gratitude to David Weber and Jane Lindskold. We will have part 2 of their discussion next week. And good night, Tony Daniel, wherever you are. This is David F. Sharirod coming to you from a soundproof bunker somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Join us here next week at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.